keynote speaker. Over the next 30 minutes, he will deliberate on the science of learning from his vast experience leading MIT's open learning systems and give us insights into the current research in cognitive sciences. This online discussion is part of the Samiksha seminar series from the Center of Teaching and Learning at IIM Bangalore. Samiksha, broadly translated from Sanskrit, refers to the process of analysis and the ability to draw deeper insights. We hope that at the end of this 1-hour session, which includes the keynote address, a panel discussion with the faculty and PhD scholars in IIM Bangalore, followed by the keynote speaker's response to a few of our viewers' questions, we will be able to reflect and practice how transformative learning takes place and therefore how teaching methods can be highly engaging to activate learners to do the real work out there in the real world. It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Sanjay Sarma, Vice President for Open Learning at MIT. He is also the Fred Ford Flowers and Bill Ford Flowers Professor of Mechanical Engineering at MIT. Since 2012, Professor Sarma has served as MIT's Director of Digital Learning, Dean for Digital Learning, and now Vice President of Open Learning. In these roles, he has led the creation of the MicroMasters program credential, developed the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, founded the Jameel World Education Lab, and created a group that seeks to transform teaching and learning throughout the world through research, curriculum development, community building, and innovative learning offerings. Currently, Professor Sarma serves on the board of edX, the not-for-profit company founded by MIT and Harvard to create and promulgate an open source platform for the distribution of free online education worldwide. He also advises several national governments and global companies. A very good morning, Sanjay. I now hand over the screen to you for the keynote address.
Thank you very much, Deepti. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, which is the most risky aspect of a presentation. And if I can pull that off, I can steam on. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. Do you see people waving? It means it's in display mode. Great. Okay. Look, it's such a pleasure to speak to you. Let me start by saying that, the way we educate today is in some sort of scientific technique that was given to us as a gift from God in some holy book, nor is it based particularly on science. A lot of our teaching comes by happenstance. Actually, the oldest education institution we know is Taxashila, which is, of course, in Pakistan, then Nalanda and so on. Those traditions are somewhat lost, although many of them survive in Indian culture. But then Islamic and then Christian universities, the oldest extant university by some measures is in Morocco, Al-Qarawiyyin, and then Christian monasteries became the place where universities started. We still, of course, have the Buddhist monastic tradition. And then actually there was a system that came out of India called the Madras system, which people in Madras don't know about. And it was copied by the British and became the Lancaster system. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was taking off, and you had to find some way to educate the kids. There's some, I think, false history that somehow our entire education system was designed to look like a factory. It's not completely true, but there's elements of that that are true. The fact of the matter is you have to put the kids somewhere, and so they put them in a factory mode education system. But the most important lesson to take away from that is the thing to do in a factory is to make products and to test them. And that became an essential aspect of our education system, which is testing. Now, fast forward to 2021, post-COVID. Even before COVID, the gig economy was taking off. It started with simple tasks, grocery delivery, ride sharing. But then over time, it is extending to more and more cognitively demanding tasks like tutoring. And then we now know that post-COVID, it isn't as if people are going to be climbing over each other. Companies aren't going to be recruiting and expanding greatly. The expectation is they will hire freelancers because it gives them more flexibility. Human beings are around the world. People have also changed, and so the gig economy is going to take off. And this is a report from Gartner from a couple of years ago on, if you look at the various job categories, how much of it is going to be gig, and you can see that as you move to more and more cognitively demanding tasks, the numbers are actually beginning to creep up. And this is an international phenomenon. What that means is that it is no longer the case that you're simply educating students so that they can get a degree from you, a chapa, as they say in Hindi, so that they can go apply for a job. Increasingly, you're going to have to prepare people to become the chief learning officers, the chief executive officers, the chief marketing officers of their own lives. It doesn't matter whether you graduated from IIM or some other university. That only matters for your first gig. Your third, fifth, seventh gig will be judged by how well you did on your previous gig. It's like an Amazon or a eBay rating, and that means that we cannot have an education system where we are trimming people to become interchangeable. I mean, you could argue that the crowning glory of the Industrial Revolution was to make interchangeable parts. I would argue, in fact, that it was different. It was to make interchangeable people. And that has got to change. And I think that we have to figure out how to empower people for the new era. And this is what I'm going to be talking about now for the next few minutes. I will just actually, before I go to this slide, just show one other slide, which is that, when COVID-19 struck, many industries were very negatively impacted. Retail, for example, it's gone fully online, right? Commercial real estate, airlines, you know the list. But many industries have been positively impacted, and there's going to be a massive job shift, even if people don't go gig. And again, the solution to that, the lifeline, is going to be oxygen, is going to be education. And education becomes critical in all this. So we need to focus more and more on knowledge transfer, less on testing and giving the chapa, because as I said, the chapa doesn't have a long shelf life. What really has shelf life is your ability to deliver and your ability to continue to deliver and to excel. So we need to look at education as we look at healthcare. Imagine healthcare before the turn of the 20th century, right? I mean, the solution to everything was bloodletting or sending people into the mountains to get fresh air. Now we have been able to spin up half a dozen vaccines within 1 year of a novel virus. I mean, this is spectacular because of genetics, because of understanding of biochemistry, molecular biochemistry, right? Our understanding of neuroscience, et cetera, et cetera. So education, I would argue, needs to move into that era. And the question is, do we have a hope? And I'm going to tell you, I think we do. And I'll explain why. And I also think that the hope hangs on a thread, and the thread is you and me and us, educational specialists. So I'm going to give you now a very brief summary of why this is the case. But I won't go too much into neuroscience because that's a rat hole and it's beautiful, but we'll spend all our time there. So this is an image of the human brain, obviously, and the front part is called the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. And there's a reason that some cultures, like in India, we call it the third eye. We, wear bindis and tilaks and so on. And the reason is that it's a recognition that the prefrontal cortex is something very special. By the way, animals don't have it, we do. And it only grows in between ages 18 and 20 something. That's why, we don't let young people drive or drink for that reason. The PFC is effectively the CEO of the brain, and it gives a regulation. It regulates emotion, the body, morality, determination. All that comes from the PFC. A lot of these things we've discovered from accidents and from wars, because people get horrifically injured, and some function goes away, and then we go, oh, that's where hearing occurs. That's where speech occurs. And the PFC was discovered through an accident that a man called Phineas Gage suffered, and he had an injury to his, to his forehead, and he lost he became an irresolute human being after being a very sensible guy. And so now we know what the PFC does, and of course now it's been proven in other ways, which I'll show you. We also know the limbic portion of the brain. This is the reward system, the fight, flight, freeze response. Emotions are related to the limbic system and the amygdala, which is a place in that area where the limbic system resides. And then this thing on the right is called the hippocampus. It's called a hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse, but that's where we know memories are formed. We know that because in the 50s, a man called Henry Molaison had epilepsy, so they removed his hippocampus, and they found that he couldn't form short-term memories anymore. So all these things have led to some amazing discoveries. And then over the last 30, 40 years, we've begun to learn more about the brain because of things like functional MRI and diffusion tensor imaging and so on. And so now you can put a patient in an MRI machine. It turns out that when the blood rushes to a part of the brain, that blood is oxygen rich because you're using that part of the brain. So let's say you're playing music and a certain part of the brain lights up. More blood will carry oxygen there. And oxygen is weakly repelled, or oxygen rich hemoglobin is weakly repelled by a magnetic field. So by doing some fancy image processing, you can figure out, tomography actually, which part of the brain is lighting up for what activity. So through that, we're able to form somewhat more precise, but there's a long, long way to go, maps of how the brain operates. And where, for example, a very interesting tidbit here, I'll tell you, we know that when you pay attention, the prefrontal cortex lights up, but then after some time, 10 minutes, we go into a state which is literally called mind wandering, where the mind starts connecting the dots. It's actually usually a good thing, not always, but usually it's a good thing because you're being creative. I'll talk about that more. By the way, uncontrolled mind wandering can lead to things like negative ideation, depression. And the only way to reset mind wandering, or one of the only ways, is mindfulness, which is a tradition deep in the Indian ethos, right? Whether it's Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, mindfulness and meditation are very deep in the ethos. So all these interesting discoveries are coming forth. And actually, even if you take a technology like functional MRI, which I mentioned to you earlier, it has a beautiful history in and of itself, and it's a very international history, which goes through, Nobel laureates like Pauling and, and Japan and China, and Korea and Korean discoveries. And it's through all that we have imaging. So that's the science, and then I'll come back to the science and refer to it. Now I want to distill it to some insights. So the insight is this. This is a picture, I grabbed it from Wikipedia about 10 years ago. And of course, now people are showing this everywhere, which is good, because the point is that this is a painting from 1308. And it's a lecture. And the lecture format has survived at least 700 years, right? I wonder if any of these folks in the classroom, one of whom you can see is sleeping off a late night, and the other of whom is distracted by his Instagram account, right, went on to become Michelangelo. Michelangelo, on the other hand, never attended a lecture. Now, Leonardo never attended a lecture. So why is it the lecture format is so resilient? It's because there is a fundamental misunderstanding that we all conveniently hold, and it's a convenience, that somehow the brain is a sheet of paper, the mind of the student is a sheet of paper, and the professor has a pen. And all the professor has to do is write on a sheet of paper and declare victory. And the science tells us, and basic logic tells us, nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is, you as a human being, as a learner, are formulating a model of the world. It's like a plant growing. When you need water, you need water. When you need potassium, you need potassium. When you need nitrogen, you need nitrogen. You can't just give a plant all the water it'll need in its life on day one and declare victory. But that's sort of how we do education, right? We teach math 101, and you should be good with math. But of course, you forget math, and you need it when you need it, and then you don't recall it. And we wag a finger and say, look, I already wrote it on your mind. How could you forget? But as I'll tell you, forgetting is an essential mechanism in learning, and we have made no space for it. So the fact is, the way we construct a model of the world is like this. We, you have little nuggets of knowledge. You can only eat little morsels. That's a crazy thing. And every parent knows this, by the way. Just look at the way you treat your children. And children are evolved to learn. And that same evolutionary instinct applies to adults, including people of our age, certainly my age. The point is that it doesn't change. It's the same evolutionary instinct. So the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, they play together. And what they do is, when the information comes in little nuggets, I put it in the form of this leprechaun, and the leprechaun fills up a tiny little cauldron, runs back, has to reformat the information to make it useful, right? And then reorganize it into the treasury that's your mind, so that at a later date, when you need that information, you can use it. But by the way, that is the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and also the hippocampus together. This is called consolidation, integration, sense making. This is essential. And this is also has to happen repeatedly to create this, because you have to reorder things in the treasury. But we never give it time. Instead, we tire this poor guy out, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, right? And the result of that is students tune out, like the gentleman I showed you in that picture from Bologna in 1308. And we have a lot of science behind it. Many have argued against this model, by the way, including Thoreau, Alcott, Krishnamurti, Emerson, Maria Montessori. They've actually argued against it without understanding the science. What I'm telling you is the science backs them up. It does not back up the dogmas that we follow in academia. I've written a couple of books on the topic, particularly GRASP, which is a science of learning. And then more recently, this year, we wrote a book on workforce education, on the future of learning. So the key principles, I won't go through them all, but I'll give you a taste of them. And I'm going fast, forgive me, but you'll have my slides and you can, I'm happy to share them. I'm violating my own principles, but such is our fate in Zoom world. So mind wandering, I just mentioned it to you. It's when you're focusing, you can see that the brain, you can see all the activities concentrated in these points A and B. But then when you aren't able to concentrate, meta-awareness means when it's a form of mindfulness. You can control the mind wandering. If you don't, it's all over the place, right? Mind wandering sets in after about 10 minutes of learning. Yet every lecture in every classroom in the world is at least 45 minutes, 1 hour, 90 minutes. So I can assure you that the remaining 20 minutes, the remaining 50 minutes, the remaining 1 hour and 20 minutes is wasted because the student does something worse than learn. The student develops false familiarity. They don't actually learn. They don't actually grok it. So here's a sort of a complicated graph, but I'll explain it to you simply. Okay, so this gentleman, by the way, is Hermann Ebbinghaus. It's actually rather profound. So what he did was just, ignore the graph for a second. He locked himself in an attic in Paris 140 years ago. He's considered probably the first great psychologist, although I would argue that Patanjali was a great psychologist. But anyway, so he would lock himself and he would memorize random words and then see how he forgot them, right? How he could recall them. And what he discovered is something rather profound. He found that when you learn it the first time, learn, let's say 100 words, 100%, right? You're down to 50 words very quickly, you forget 50 words. But then if you're reminded and you go back to 100%, the second time you forget slowly, and the third time more slowly, and the fourth time more slowly, and the fifth time more slowly. So what he essentially said is that forgetting is an essential part of learning. And the reason for that evolutionarily is you actually had a lot of inputs this morning before you came into work this afternoon. I know it's evening there, right? You had a lot of inputs. It would be mind-bogglingly useless for you to remember all that. So the brain has to figure out some way to understand what to remember. And the way it understands what to remember is the things that are repeated. It's called a low-pass filter for those of you who know signal processing. So it turns out forgetting is essential in learning. And it's even better if you are reminded just as you're about to get rusty with something, you're more likely to remember it longer. And by the way, this is used in all the language programs, Rosetta, all those things, but no professors know about it. But yet, what do we do when a student forgets? We wave a finger at them and say, how dare you forget? Because damn it, your mind is a sheet of paper I wrote on it. How could you forget, right? You never do that to your kid. You know that your kid, you actually instinctively know as a parent not to do that, but we do that in the classroom. Why? It's the same evolutionary principle. So if you take some of those lessons and you can put them this way, there's a nice slide from Clark Quinn. If you learn slowly, you may not do as well on the day of the test, but you'll remember longer. If you cram before the test, you will do better on the day of the test, but the memories are gone because this is regurgitative. This is imbibing. The red is regurgitative and the green is imbibing. Okay. I mean, it's like a hot dog eating contest, the next day the guy's going to, throw it up, right? You don't actually put on weight. It's the same thing. Here's another principle. Again, complicated graph, I'll just tell you. When you're learning something, let's say you're learning, actually the particular example from Rohrer and Taylor, that paper, is, if I recall, calculate the surface area of a sphere versus a cone, right? If I recall, a sphere is 4 pi r squared, a cone is 1/3 pi r h. So let's say you learn that. Should the problems that you give to the students be cone, 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 sphere, 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 or cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere? And it turns out the answer is always cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere. It's called interleaving. Interleaving. But yet every chapter in every book that I know is a chapter on cones, a chapter on spheres. This has been replicated, by the way, in art history and in sports. It's called interval training in sports. It's called mixing it up. So if you're learning tennis, don't do forehand, from the back, forehand from the back, forehand from the back. Do forehand volley, forehand volley, forehand volley, or forehand backhand, forehand backhand. So this is why, by the way, these techniques in sports are, of course, on display at the Olympics right now. And these techniques are what coaches give. Actually, there's a lot of interesting work on coaching as well, the science of coaching, a book called Peak, if you're interested, which I recommend reading. We also, so something very profound. It turns out, and again, every parent knows this, that just as hunger generates saliva, and saliva makes it easier for us to learn, right? To eat and digest. The equivalent to hunger in the brain is curiosity, and the equivalent to saliva in the brain is dopamine. Novelty and curiosity generate dopamine, and the dopaminergic circuit, as it's called, is essential to learning. So in fact, if you make students hungry, the learning follows. And again, every parent knows this, right? You spend most of your time on motivation. Once it's there, everything else follows. It makes sense. It's evolutionary, because if you figured out where to find some food, and when we were hunter-gatherers, right? Or even a mouse, when a mouse figures out where to find food, right? It has to figure out where to find food. It has to be curious. So it's a survival instinct. Okay, so here's another one, very interesting. So we know for a fact that if you do something with your hands, you learn it better. Even a gesture like the right hand rule, you learn it better. This actually comes back to Indian philosophy and Yoga Sutra and things like that, which is the mind-body connection, which was rejected, strangely enough, by Descartes. René Descartes, the great French philosopher, he was trying to actually protect science from religion. And he said, no, the mind is everything. The body is simply a vehicle. But in fact, what we know now is that the mind and the body are deeply connected, even in learning. It's called embodied cognition. So if you'll, for example, teach someone vectors, if you teach a young person vectors, a kid, make them walk out the vectors. Say north is Y and east is X. And make them walk the vectors out. They will learn better. That's called embodied cognition. It's beautiful. It has to do with how the motor cortex gets engaged. So we know all these principles. Now, how do we teach today? The way we teach today is we have all these principles. I haven't gone through all of them. For example, I mentioned coaching in passing. I mentioned hands-on learning, curiosity. But anyway, we have all these principles. The way we teach today is we do only lectures in on-site classrooms. That's it, right? Why? It's actually pretty good for exams, and it's convenient. And we have this convenient, self-consistent, if completely displaced and removed from the reality of learning, right? Savita, go ahead. It's okay, Savita, we can come back then, okay? Okay, let's come back. So how should we teach, right? Oh, by the way, I should say that, and all the stuff we don't do, we just ignore it because the classroom time is taken up by these one-way lectures. Now, COVID actually did something bad to us, because what we did in COVID was we just took this bad practice and we put it on Zoom. And Zoom has neither the upside of in-person connection, and nor is it good online education. Good online education is this.
Translation, universal genetic code, ribosomes, all very simple. This time we're going to talk about all the variations on the theme. Because it turns out that...
Oops. So I just wanted to pause that. So this gentleman is Eric Lander. He's one of he's actually in the White House now. He's the President Biden's chief. He's an MIT professor, chief scientific advisor, and he is led one of the two teams that sequence the human genome. Look at this. Okay, you can pause it, you can rewind it. If your mind wanders, you can go back. You have text here. A lot of students watch it 2x if they know it, so they can adapt to it, right? This is good online. This is not. And by the way, this is what we do with edX. And of course, IIM Bangalore is a member of edX as well. So the problem with the Zoom lectures, we did the worst of both worlds. Neither this nor good lecturing or good classroom practice. It's terrible, actually. So people think we learned about from COVID. We didn't. We learned what not to do. The only thing we learned was the convenience of not having to be, in two places at the same time. So the way we must teach in the future is the lectures must go online. And a lot of the things that retrieval effect, spaced repetition that you can't do in the classroom, you can actually do better online. Right? And that's basically what the edX software enables. And by the way, the future of edX, you've probably heard about this big edX transaction, the nonprofit piece of edX, the edX.org. This is what we're going to focus on. And then in the classroom, you should be focusing on this, coaching, the curiosity, the hands-on learning, the field trips, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to take gumption. And that's going to take a lot of us changing our practices. When we have the honor and the privilege of being back together in the classroom, we better make it count. So I won't bore you too much more. I'll just say that, this is what we've done at MIT. We launched OpenCourseWare. Actually, I was involved in launching OpenCourseWare 20-something years ago. We've more than 200 million visitors. Then we launched MITx. We turned them to edX. You know that story. Actually, at MIT, I initiated the MicroMasters. We now have more than 1 million enrollees at MIT itself, and there are 50 plus MicroMasters from 25 universities. And we do all this, of course, because the world can access our online content, but particularly because we use the same online content to flip our own classrooms. That's the bottom line, right? And what I showed you in the previous table was the flipped classroom, but explained in a cognitive scientific way, as opposed to, just flip your classroom. So I have just one or two more slides. I'll say that how will the world change vis-a-vis education, right? We have to focus on authentic learning versus exam success. Immersive learning is the future. Virtual reality, all these things will enter the picture. When a student graduates, they'll work in a company, and in a company, they'll be working on, let's say, I don't know, if you're an engineer, maintaining a jet engine. Virtual reality is going to enter their world, and then they're going to use the VR to also learn. Lifelong continuous education, agile education. In fact, I call this agile continuous education, ACE. And we're launching a movement around ACE. And we think that ACE is something that a lot of education institutions can rally around and reinvent, not just how they educate their students, but how they keep in touch with their students for life. And the social contract of universities has to change. So I'll end by saying that learning is the new oxygen. And it's a pleasure to meet colleagues and friends who are privileged enough to participate in this space. So with that, I'll take my slides down and come back to you, Deepti.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this very informative and interesting talk. Before we move to the next segment of this webinar, I would like to welcome the audience in this webinar to direct your questions to our keynote speaker in the chat box. Please keep those questions coming. We now move to the second part of this program, which is a panel discussion consisting of faculty and PhD scholars of IIM Bangalore with our keynote speaker, Professor Sanjay Sarma. The panel consists of Professor Saurabh Mukherjee from the OB and HRM area, Professor Srinivasan R from the strategy area, Professor Jitamitra Desai from the decision sciences area, and PhD scholar Anupama Kondaya. I now invite the panelists to deliberate with Professor Sharma.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and start the discussion, I think. Good morning, Professor Sharma, and thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, for the book and the insights that you shared with us. I'm so glad to be part of this panel and have the opportunity to ask you this question. So I had a couple of questions, but I think I'll start with one, which kind of was going on in my head as I was reading the book. I could relate to the book a lot as a student of, as a past student of engineering. and also from the research aspect. But as a faculty member in training, possibly for a business school, I was wondering what would be your advice or words of caution, nuances, etc., to try and translate these ideas to business school teaching, where we do use the case method a little bit, from an application perspective. But as you said, the pandemic has caused us to sort of roll back a little bit, and constrain ourselves to the lecture mode more so on Zoom, etc. Also, since we'll be training managers, so to speak, who will be managing these uncertainties in the future, how can they make sense of this world? Many of them come from backgrounds, as you said, which are more of the mind as a sheet of paper sort of assumption backgrounds, and then are coming into our sort of contexts. So what would be your advice, and how could we take these ideas forward?
I'm not a business school person, Anupama. I'm an engineer, although I'm also an entrepreneur. So I guess I'm a businessman. My view is that sometimes the biggest challenge is convincing the students that they need to take this approach, because students themselves have spent years being taught the old way, right? Exams are not bad, by the way. Okay, I'm just saying that we're focused entirely on exams. The way to think about it is that if the student doesn't buy into this education approach, it will seem strange, it'll seem different, it'll seem foreign. And and by the way, this way of learning, strangely, you feel sometimes that you're learning less. It's called, for reasons I can explain, but you actually learn more, you imbibe more. It's very strange because our measures of learning that they've been trained into are such that their metrics are different. So one of the things we do at MIT with these techniques is we actually we have sessions with our students where we explain some of these concepts to make sure they understand why learning this way makes a difference. And then we ease into it. If you just jump right into it, right, the students are not participants. And then you just don't get that jugalbandi, It's got to be a jugalbandi. It's got to be a two-way street. And once you get into that mode, I have to tell you, I teach dynamics, which is a pretty hard subject, right? Especially the way I teach it, because we go into pretty significant depth. But once you get the jugalbandi going, every time I teach the course, I learn. I get an insight, and it's got to be like that. So that's my suggestion.
Right. Thank you.
And by the way, especially with managers, if they have any experience, they're going to give you a lot back, and it's such a pleasure to get that insight back. It's like playing tennis.
Right. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Anupama. Hi, Sanjay. I'm JD. I'm a faculty member in the Decision Sciences group. I wanted to ask you about, one of the things that you write in your book about one of the fallacies of, standardized testing and how it has sort of winnowed out a lot of people from the mainstream curriculum. My question is, one of the reasons why ideas succeed is not because, the idea is the best, but perhaps because it's scalable. And how do you sort of take your ideas forward in terms of the science of learning and make that, if I remove standardized testing from the education system today, how does your approach or what you've learned sort of come across as being scalable?
Jerry, good question. Just to clarify, I'm actually not completely opposed to standardized testing. I actually think standardized testing, SATs need to be there. Don't get me wrong, right? Because standardized testing gives voice to people you might otherwise ignore. It's a leveling thing. So I'm actually not one of those who says get rid of SATs, get rid of the IIT exams. That's not my point, right? I'm saying you can't depend on it entirely. Many years ago, I had a knee surgery and they gave me a crutch. And I was recovering from it. And then I ran into my physical therapist on the street and he stopped me and said, "You're using the crutch too much." He said, lift the crutch. Try not to touch the ground, every step. Try and touch it every 2 or 3 steps. And eventually I got rid of the crutch. So standardized testing helps because it does support what we do. Now, having said, the other unfortunate fact is authentic testing, right, is difficult. It's expensive. But the beauty of a place like IIM Bangalore is you can actually do it. So for example, you may recall many years ago, we used to have this thing called a Viva as a test, right? Viva means live, right? The problem with that is people go, "Oh my God, it's subjective. I was badly treated." But in fact, it turns out to be a better test. Imagine a quiz show in which you don't ask someone what the most popular dessert in Bengal is, but a quiz show in which you serve to the participants rasmalai and gulab jamun and a bunch of other things, and you say, "What is it?" That's authentic testing. But for that, you have to buy Rasmalai and give it to the quiz show participants, right? It's the difference between bookish knowledge and really knowing what Rasmalai is. So look, it's not, I'm not answering your question because it's a sort of a huge expanse of topics there, but we have to make inroads towards authenticity in testing. We can't completely give up the crutch either.
All right, thank you. I'm going to follow that up with a question perhaps where, if you're an instructor, if your goal is to say, bring, the bottom 20% of the class to a better grade versus say taking, the top 5% and making them superstars, does that science of learning change based on what your goal or the objective of the faculty is?
Again, it depends, JD. You take your great institution, IIM Bangalore, you're not getting a lot of duds there, all right? I mean, it's hard to get in, right? So it's more a matter of ensuring that the people who are in the bottom 20%, maybe it's a motivation issue, right? So or maybe it's a mindset issue, maybe it's an attitude, maybe it's a personal problem, right? Maybe they regret coming to IIM. So it's sometimes we sort of apply the same mechanism to all, but what I have found at MIT, and we have found at MIT, is it's a multidimensional set of inputs you have to the students. And the same input doesn't apply to all of them, right? So sometimes if the students are struggling, we might find that, they just didn't have a particular math course and we have to sort of give them a different background and it suddenly got exposed, right? So again, I'm not answering your question, but my point is that I think that the superstars can become more successful if we take a transformative approach, but we can actually take the bottom 20%, bottom in some dimension, right? And transform them as well. The key is to take an approach that I'm going to transform every individual to the best of my ability to make them successful, as opposed to here's a spectrum, right? And I'm going to figure out where to spend my money. And this means effort, unfortunately, right? Look, parenting is not scalable. Teaching is a form of parenting, right? Really, because that's our evolutionary prerogative. Online displaces time or gives us time to get into the transformation business and the personal connection business.
I leave it to my other panelists, but I'll end by saying that, my kids are going to be very happy with you, Sanjay, because, their mind wanders all the time and they hear daddy say, well, keep your focus on the test. So I'm going to now remind them that mind wandering perhaps is great.
Mind wandering is good. Mind wandering is good. I can assure you that Steve Jobs' mind wandered a lot. And a lot of people who cracked the SATs and came to MIT, their mind didn't wander, but it's a mind wandering that gave Steve Jobs his creativity, right? Of course, the problem with that is it's 1 in a million, 1 in a billion. But I think we need to give it a little, give your kids some freedom, JD. They'll enjoy it.
Thank you, Sanjay.
So I'm going to build on JD's question. This is Srini. Building on JD's question about standardized tests, we're actually talking about comprehension. We're talking about testing comprehension. We're talking about testing how much they have understood or imbibed something. How do we test their application? How do they test judgment? A lot of business school learning, our success is measured by how good they're able to make judgments. The example that you gave about Steve Jobs' mind wandering, at the end of all of this wandering, he was able to make good judgments. How do we imbibe, how do we educate people to make good judgments? How do we test judgments?
I think we are at the we are at the front edge of this question, okay? Judgment is very hard to judge, ironically. It's a meta skill. The more meta you go, it's harder to judge.
Yeah.
Now, if you take sports, right? If you take cricket, for example, you take Anil Kumble, right? Anil Kumble in 2008, he's a dear friend, so I'm very fond of him and very proud of what he did. But let's say that he's in Bangalore. Let's say was it 2008 when he broke his jaw, right? And he walked in the West Indies with a bandage to bat. That is grit. There is no test for that. How do you test for that, right? So our challenge is, but you only have students for a period of time. You only have them for 2 years or whatever it is.
That's right.
So the question really is, and I think this is the ultimate intellectual question for academics, is how do you create methods to judge capability outside of tests, just a regurgitative test, in the limited interaction and time you have with your students? And I would argue that the way to do that is actually try and transform the person. And in the process, you get insights, and to trust that subjective information you get. I'm not telling you I have all the answers. I'm just telling you that excellence does not come from a convenient test. It comes from different things that in fact give you false signals in the early judgment.
So can we just following up on this? Is practice a good way of doing judgment?
Yes.
Because judgment is also following up on these principles about interleaving and all of that.
That's right. So practice, in fact, Srinivasan, absolutely is, in my view, the ultimate way to judge. I mean, how did Michelangelo become the great? And by the way, there's a book by a Renaissance artist and writer by the name of Giorgio Vasari. And if you're interested, you should read it. He talks about all these people and how they learn. So, and there's another book called, I mentioned it earlier, Peak, and I think the Science of Expertise by Anders Ericsson. Excellent book. He passed away last year, unfortunately, but a really wonderful book. And what they talk about is the power of coaching.
Yeah.
We've lost it. We don't do enough of it, right? So that's what I mean by transformation. If one takes an approach to coaching, it's the other term for it is deliberate practice. Then the act of coaching is also the act of judging.
But
and
for,
the act of transforming.
Yeah. So, sorry, and the last follow-up question. Deliberate coaching requires complete surrender from the participant, from the learner. The learner should fully trust the coach to follow the program of coaching. And that's where we are unable to convince a lot of adults to say that, you know what, I am your best judge of what you need to do to be able to become an expert in what you do. The traditional Indian Gurukul system was about surrender.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't actually agree with that. Because I've coached some really hot-headed young people, and it's not so much surrender as much as trust. I've actually had a lot of people who've never surrendered ever, that we have become trusting. And I actually learned from them as well. I mean, obviously, if the student is being a jerk, that's a whole other thing. Then there's other, but total surrender is, in my view, not necessary, because the problem with total surrender is you're asking them to drop their judgment also. But if one takes the approach that I will learn from that student too, you're not asking them to drop their judgment. Again, you get the jugalbandi going. So I'm actually not one in favor of total surrender. I find that actually to be a sort of in India and China, I find that quite often. And I actually discourage it. When we get students from IIT, from other schools here, and they sir me, I say, no, you're going to call me Sanjay, and you're going to push back on me, and we'll get better. I'll get better too. So it's a wrestling match, but a gentle one, So it's a subtly different thing, Srinivas, and I hope I didn't completely disagree with you, but that's my view.
Hello, Sanjay. Saurabh here. So my question, Sanjay, would be that in your book, you have given a very powerful message that education should be accessible and it should also be fun and enjoyable, right? And I really love that. But on the other hand, you have also touched upon today and also in your book about this whole thing about degree of difficulty, right? That unless there is certain amount of difficulty, people don't learn. And somehow there is probably a trend that education should be entertainment, right? We have to do everything to make the students happy, videos, dancing, animation, so on and so forth. So any thoughts on that how do we balance these two conditions?
Yeah. It's called scaffolding. So imagine, let me give you an example of a young person learning to cycle, right? The best way to do it, which none of us do, by the way, is to put training wheels, right? Which are 2 wheels on the side, and then to lift the wheels as the person gets better. What do we do? When my daughter was young, she had training wheels, and then suddenly I put her on a bicycle and she kept falling off. But if you lift the wheels gently, you release the scaffold. That's the way to do it. Here's another one. You're teaching a kid to swim. You put these, inflatable arm floats. You put 3, reduce it to 2, reduce it to 1, then remove it. So what happens then is that the learning curve is made more gentle by the scaffolding. And that, to me, is a great pedagogical feat, to create that scaffolded path. And this is what I've seen in sports. If I look at the difference between, take the MRF Academy in India, that's what it did to Indian pace bowlers, right? It just breaks it down and builds it up. So the scientific approach to pedagogy, to me, is something we don't pay enough attention to. And I think, Saurav, we can achieve what you're talking about with scaffolding. It's exactly. So Rajeshri talks about the zone of proximal development. The great Russian psychologist and philosopher Vygotsky wrote about that. That's precisely correct. The zone of proximal development.
Anupama, do you want to? Oh, sorry.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes.
Okay. So Sanjay, the other thing that was coming to me was when I was reading your book that you are talking so much about education, which is kind of one side of the story, right? Which is the, if I may use the term, supply side of the story. What about the demand side, right? I mean, isn't there a lot of onus on the student also to absorb and, be attentive in the class? And also, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, am I also responsible for that? Or there has to be something from that side also?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, again, you're in IIM Bangalore. You're very blessed. I'm very blessed. The vast majority of students are driven and have self-selected, right? Now, just imagine if you're at a community college in America where you have a single parent working 2 jobs and struggling with life or something else. There is actually our understanding of psychology is evolving. For example, there's motivation. There's a lot of interesting work on motivation, right? There is grit. Someone posted here a link to Ritwik posted a link to a paper, the work on grit. Angela Duckworth, one of my colleagues, John Gabrielli, has done a lot of work on grit, right? There's a growth mindset, which the professor from Stanford, I'm shocked I don't remember her name, wrote about, which, by the way, Satya Nadella evoked in his book on how he transformed Microsoft. So it's a multi-dimensional thing. And the problem in our education systems is we don't take that approach. Our approach is one of winnowing. You made it, you didn't, okay, you're off the boat, you're off the bus, right? If we do, and that's what we do at MIT, the mindset is growth mindset. Yeah, if Carol Dweck, correct, the growth mindset, thank you. If you take that approach of transforming, which we can afford to do at MIT, I understand it's not possible in every institution. I suspect it is possible in IIM Bangalore, is you've got to sort of approach everyone from each of these perspectives and help them psychoanalyze themselves, right? And give them the tools and figure out why it isn't working. And often I have students who say, this is not for me, and I really want to be something else. And I actually got an email just a few weeks ago from a student who left MIT 15 years ago. And he became a successful, he's a sort of a sports cyclist, right? And he says, but I appreciate all the conversations we had because I discovered this is the path I want to take. It's the force-fitting, societal pressures, etc., put people in awkward positions. It happens a lot in India. And then to Srinivasan's point, then you get into this mode of you've got to submit, otherwise there's no point being here. But that's more a result of the circumstance, in my view, than the individual. Look, I mean, all this is easy to do. You know that when you're teaching sometime, or easy to talk about, right? You have to all hands on deck, figure this out. And there'll be situations where you can figure it out and some future generation will, but at least we can take steps in that direction.
Thank you to our, yes, Katie, you had a question.
Sorry, is there time for a question or?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. All right, Sanjay, so let me just sort of follow that up with, so in business schools, we do this 2x2 matrix. So if I were to rank subjects from highly quantitative to qualitative, and on the other side, if I rank kids or people from younger ages to older ages, if I asked you to fill up that matrix, how would that look like?
Very interesting. So say that again. So if you're younger to older, how does it change is what you're saying? Right. So let's say on the y-axis, I have people younger to older, and on the x-axis, I have quantitative subjects to qualitative subjects. Right. I mean, yeah. So look, first of all, younger to older is very interesting. The difference between adults and kids is kids are forming frameworks. Adults already have frameworks. So when you see something new, a kid is forming the first, what Piaget called the template, right, to take it on, right? The schema is what he called it actually. So that's why kids are so cute, and it's they work on surprise. If you show a kid that all these experiments, a car going on a table, they lose interest. But you see the car suddenly fly, they go, oh my God, that broke my schema, right? An adult says, yeah, you have a string somewhere back there, they have a schema to explain it, right? So, and then from quantitative to qualitative, very interesting. Kids are particularly good at just picking up quantitative stuff just because they're forming words, learning language, numerology, they're very good at it. Adults, because they're looking at schema, the qualitative becomes even more important. But even for quick kids, qualitative is important if the kid isn't motivated, because that means they are seeking the qualitative, right? But especially for adults, if you don't tell them why the hell they need to learn it and they already have all sorts of templates, they aren't going to learn it, right? So the qualitative becomes very important. Often adults come with that qualitative background anyway. They know it's important. So you got to almost psychoanalyze to figure out where the qualitative is important, where the quantitative, but we do change as we grow older.
But the principles of interleaving and repetition and all of that remains the same no matter what subject it is and no matter what.
Not only that, JD, but interleaving and space repetition can be replicated in fruit flies. I know you don't have any fruit flies enrolled in IIM Bangalore, but should you ever, please do an experiment, you'll find they learn better. It's even replicated in C. elegans, which is the worm that they use for various experiments. That's how fundamental it is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for this very engaging discussion. We now take some questions from the chat box, and I'll just read them out for you, Sanjay. So there is this question from Saurabh Bajaj, who's asking, many online learning platforms allow self-paced learning, and seemingly most learners do not follow indicated learning journeys. Such learning behavior can lead to suboptimal learning outcomes. Why would edX or Coursera not force spaced receptive learning?
Well, first of all, self-paced learning, in edX, we are doing it. In fact, one of the reasons we spun out the nonprofit to run the open source with $800 million, at least a piece of it will be spent on putting that in. All this takes time and effort, right? If professors don't know what spaced learning is, you can't just put it in. They have to create the problem sets, you have to put it in. You know, if you use Babbel or Rosetta or Duolingo, they use it, believe it or not, right? Those engineers know it, but professors don't. So you got to put it in, that's one. The second thing is enforcing learning. The problem with self-paced is you need a social contract, which is that I will learn this stuff, right? And I will show up to class with this learn. And the professor is to enforce it, right? And the way you enforce it is, for example, having a quiz at the beginning of the class. I used to have pre-readings and I'd give my students quizzes, pop quizzes, first 5 minutes of the class, just to show, and they weren't high stakes. They weren't punitive, but I'd make them do it, right? So all this is a social cultural change and it takes time.
Yeah. And another question from Venkatesh, who's asking, another bane is the fixed time needed to learn that is imposed on all students. Clearly, students learn at different speeds, which also changes over time. The Montessori system allows students at different age and skill levels to be together. The same with the Gurukul system practiced in early India. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, so the Gurukul system led to what is then became the Madras system. Check it out. There's a Madras college. It used to be where the Egmore station is now, in that area. And then that became a part of European education ethos. There's a Madras college still in the University of Edinburgh, Glasgow, somewhere, I've forgotten. And Maria Montessori rekindled it independently. She's a hero in my view. And Maria Montessori was stuck in India, by the way, during World War II because she was Italian, and so part of the Axis country. So she was jailed, as in she was free to move in India, but she was in India. So we have a bunch of Montessori schools, and then Jiddu Krishnamurti and Rishi Valley, which is where a lot of my family went. They also picked up some of those ideas. The key thing is this. The key insight is this: when you put kids of different ages together. And by the way, this applies to adults too. One of them becomes the teacher to the others. And one of the best ways to understand something is to teach someone else. And actually, when a person learns from someone closer in proximal development to them, they're going to learn sort of better because the expert has a blind spot, but someone closer is a little bit better. So we find that with our teaching assistants at MIT. They're grad students, only a couple of years older than the undergrads. And you get peer teaching. And even within classes, we get peer teaching. And within edX, we have peer teaching. That's what the forum does. So that's the secret behind the Madras system, the Gurukul system, and of course, Montessori.
Okay. A lot of questions coming up about how to bring in some methods to drive entrepreneurial learning programs. Like for instance, the pandemic has kind of disrupted the executive education, and I know there's a lot of changes happening in US universities because, a lot of clients are not able to send their executives to campuses to continue that learning. So what kind of, learning methods can one adopt so that this segment of the population also can be met?
So I think I would distinguish innovation from entrepreneurship. In fact, I teach an innovation course at MIT, and we put it on our online offerings from MIT X Pro. And I think that I know that both in innovation and entrepreneurship, there are a lot of shared skills. For example, the lean approach, agility, Scrum, software development techniques, testing, things like that. There are all sorts of techniques. That's one that you can teach online for sure. It's actually fun to do. It's easy to do. And these techniques are sometimes very surprising to people, who are used to waterfall, who are used to systematic, hierarchical, design, etc. Having said that, it's sort of like teaching surgery online. You can't do it. In the end, you have to do surgery, right? I certainly wouldn't want to go under the knife of a surgeon who hasn't actually been in an OR, or a pilot who's never actually flown a plane, good as flight simulators are. So one of the things, again, you have in Bangalore is you have an ecosystem. And one of the things we would do at MIT is we recruit the ecosystem. And our students go out there and, it's like war fighting. It's one thing to learn how to shoot a gun. It's another thing to fire back when a bullet whizzes by your head. I come from a military family and I know this, right? So you've got to put people out in the field. And I would recruit the ecosystem. It should be a part of IIM Bangalore.
Thank you, Sanjay, for the engaging and interactive session that we've had. I'm sure it's been a very enriching learning experience for all of us. I now invite Professor Chetan Subramanian, our Dean Faculty, to formally conclude this session and to announce the topic for the next in this series. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks a lot, Sanjay. I think there was a terrific session and lots of food for thought. We had the book distributed at IIM Bangalore, so in case some of you haven't picked up the book Grasp, I would advise, please get it. I mean, it's absolutely engaging. We hope to see you sometime at IIM Bangalore, Professor Sarma, on your next visit. Thanks, Deepti and the panel and all our participants. Very engaging session. So thank you all. And before I close, I just want to remind everybody that we, on our next panel, we have, it's on August 26th, and the topic is the future of the case method as a pedagogical tool. We have Andrew Jack, the global education editor from the Financial Times, who will be moderating the session. We have Dr. Elias Jan from Yale University, Professor V.G. Narayan from Harvard, and Professor Srivarthini Jaff from IIM Bangalore. So look forward to seeing all of you on August 26th. Thanks again. Thanks again, Professor Sarma.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you all. Take care and please stay healthy. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.